They say empaths are born to heal the world. But what no one tells you is that without boundaries, that same gift becomes a curse. Without boundaries, the empath becomes the very thing they swore to never be, a reflection of the darkness they once tried to save. Because when you absorb everyone's pain without releasing it, when you carry the emotional weight of others without discernment, you don't just feel their wounds, you become them. And that's the tragedy of the unguarded empath. They confuse martyrdom for love, self-erasure for compassion, and exhaustion for virtue. Carl Jung warned of this long before anyone dared to speak of energy or empaths. He said, "The greatest danger in being too good is that you forget you are also human. And when the human is forgotten, the shadow takes over." The empath's downfall doesn't begin with cruelty, it begins with compassion. The kind that has no limits. The kind that bleeds into every wound it touches until it becomes infected by the very suffering it sought to cure. Because make no mistake, energy transfers. Emotion infects. Suffering spreads through proximity. You cannot stand in the storm forever without becoming soaked by its rain. You think you're helping, but what you're doing is drowning quietly. The empath who refuses to set boundaries will eventually break. And when they do, something ancient awakens, something bitter, dark, and tired. It's the voice that says, "I gave everything, and no one cared." It's the slow corrosion of the soul that begins when compassion is not reciprocated, when kindness becomes currency for manipulation, when love becomes a weapon used against you. And that corrosion, that slow, invisible decay, is how the empath begins to resemble the very narcissists and manipulators they once sought to heal. Because unhealed empathy becomes resentment. Unchecked compassion becomes control. When you give endlessly without boundaries, you start expecting others to be like you, to feel like you, to love like you, to understand like you, and when they don't, you begin to resent them. You start manipulating with silence, with guilt, with passive withdrawal. You become moral, superior, self-righteous. You start to see yourself as the good one, the savior, the martyr, and everyone else as ungrateful, selfish, unworthy. Do you see it? This is how the empath slowly becomes the shadow of their own light. Jung said that the brighter the light, the darker the shadow. The empath who refuses boundaries is a burning sun, radiant, generous, magnetic, but without discipline. That same sun becomes a wildfire, consuming everything, including itself. Every empath begins as the healer, but without awareness, they end as the wound. Because love without boundaries is not love, it's possession. It's the unconscious belief that if I give enough, I can fix you. When what you're really saying is, if I fix you, maybe I'll finally be safe. That's not compassion. That's fear disguised as virtue. You were not put here to carry the pain of the world. You were put here to understand it, to transform it, not to absorb it. But empaths who refuse to draw a line become emotional sponges for the collective unconscious. They absorb everyone's projections, traumas, and despair until their own identity dissolves. And in that dissolution, they begin to mirror what they once hated. Because when the light loses form, it becomes darkness. And this is where the empath's descent begins, when they start believing that their suffering makes them pure, that their exhaustion makes them holy, that their silence makes them wise. But suffering does not sanctify you. It only sanctifies awareness when you learn from it. If you don't, it mutates. It turns your empathy into control. You begin giving not because you want to, but because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. You fear rejection. You fear guilt. You fear being called selfish. So you keep saying yes when your soul is screaming no. And every yes that violates your truth becomes a small death. This is how good people become bitter, how healers become hollow, how saints become sinners in disguise. You start to project your pain onto the world, the same way the narcissist once projected theirs onto you. You begin to manipulate in subtle, righteous ways. You guilt-trip people for not appreciating your sacrifices. You martyr yourself in the name of love, but secretly you crave recognition. And this is the shadow side of empathy. It's not evil, it's unconscious. But the unconscious left unchecked is what drives evil. The empath's greatest threat has never been the narcissist, it has always been themselves. Because every empath has a breaking point, the moment when they realize that the world does not reward goodness, that kindness without boundaries invites exploitation, that love without discernment attracts the hungry, not the healed. And when that realization comes, when the scales finally fall from their eyes, the danger begins. Some empaths awaken, they reclaim their power, set boundaries, learn discernment, and rise as sovereign beings. Others, however, break, they swing to the opposite extreme. They become cold, cynical, detached. They suppress their empathy out of survival and begin to feed on the same emotional energy they once gave away. They become what Jung called possessed by the shadow. This is the empath turned predator, the one who manipulates through morality, who gaslights through guilt, who disguises control as care. They have not healed, they have inverted. And inversion is just another form of bondage. Because when you become the opposite of what hurt you, you are still ruled by it. Freedom is not found in rejection of your pain. It's found in integration. To be a true empath, not a victim of your gift, but a master of it, you must face your shadow. You must see the part of you that enjoys being the martyr, the part that feeds on being needed, the part that confuses pity for love. You must look at the part that fears boundaries because it equates boundaries with abandonment. And you must realize that your need to save others is often just a reflection of your desire to be saved. That's not judgment, that's awareness. And awareness is the beginning of transformation. Because once you see your shadow clearly, it no longer controls you. You begin to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are mirrors. They reflect what belongs to you and what does not. They separate love from attachment, compassion from compulsion, giving from self-erasure. And when you learn this, something powerful happens. Your empathy becomes clean. It's no longer driven by guilt or fear or ego. It becomes an act of awareness. You give not to fix, but to honor. You help not to feel worthy, but because it is your nature. This is the empath's rebirth, the shift from savior to seer. You stop identifying with the wound and start embodying wisdom. You realize that love is not about absorption, it's about clarity. You are not here to carry the darkness of others. You are here to illuminate it. And you cannot illuminate what you have allowed to consume you. So you begin to set boundaries, not out of anger, but out of reverence for your energy. You start saying no, not because you've become cold, but because you've become conscious. You start valuing your peace more than your approval, your truth more than your reputation, your soul more than your image. And that is when your empathy stops being a burden and starts becoming a gift again. Because boundaries don't make you less kind, they make you more effective. They transform your compassion from self-destruction into divine precision. They turn your sensitivity into strength, your vulnerability into vision. And slowly the monster you fear, the narcissist, the manipulator, the abuser, loses all power over you. Because you've realized that the only way to defeat the darkness is not to fight it, but to stop feeding it. The moment you stop giving your energy to the unhealed, you stop inheriting their chaos. You stop rescuing people who enjoy drowning. You stop mistaking sacrifice for love. You stop identifying with suffering as proof of your goodness. You become the calm in the storm, not the storm itself. And this is the highest form of empathy. Awareness without absorption. It's seeing pain without taking it personally. It's witnessing darkness without becoming it. That's when you understand what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The empath who masters boundaries has made their darkness conscious. They no longer fear becoming the monster because they have already looked it in the eye and realized it was only their unhealed self asking to be seen. They no longer seek to save others because they have already saved themselves. And in doing so, They become what the world desperately needs. Not saints, not martyrs, but whole human beings, grounded, aware, compassionate, and unbreakable. Because the empath who learns boundaries doesn't just survive, they transform. They stop reflecting the pain of others and start reflecting truth itself. And the truth is this: you were never meant to carry the world's suffering. You were meant to awaken it. Not through sacrifice, through self-awareness. Not through control, through consciousness. Not through absorption, through alignment. Because when your empathy becomes conscious, it no longer devours you. It elevates you. It turns your gift into power. And that power, silent, radiant, sovereign, is what separates the empath who heals from the empath who becomes the monster they once feared. And when that truth finally anchors into the empath's soul, it doesn't arrive as some euphoric revelation. It arrives as a quiet, almost devastating stillness. Because the empath begins to realize how much of their life, their love, their purpose, their very identity has been built on the illusion that they must suffer to matter. The realization hurts at first. It feels like grief, the grief of losing a version of yourself that once felt noble, needed, even holy. But that grief is sacred. It's not destruction, it's purification. It's the shedding of false light, the light that blinds rather than reveals. Because until now, the empath has confused being good with being absent. They believed that love meant erasing themselves, and that compassion meant saying yes to everything. But what they called empathy was often just avoidance. Avoidance of confrontation, avoidance of boundaries, avoidance of the fear that maybe they are not infinite. They discover, painfully and beautifully, that real empathy is not about dissolving, it's about discerning. It's about seeing clearly what belongs to you and what does not. Jung wrote that the unconscious will always find a way to reveal itself, and for the empath, that revelation comes when their compassion collapses under its own weight. The empath who has spent years saving others begins to see the pattern. Every time they rescue someone from their pain, they inherit that pain. Every time they silence their truth to keep the peace, the silence becomes poison inside them. It is in this realization that the empath is reborn not as a saint, not as a victim, but as a sovereign soul. They finally understand that boundaries are not walls to keep others out, but channels that allow love to flow without corruption. Boundaries are sacred architecture. They give form to your spirit so it doesn't spill into chaos. And once the empath learns to build that architecture, their energy begins to transform. The exhaustion that once defined them starts to fade. The resentment dissolves. The endless emotional roller coaster stabilizes. They no longer feel dragged through the underworld of other people's chaos because they have found their own center, the still point within the storm. And this new version of the empath is something entirely different. They are no longer drawn to suffering as a magnet is drawn to metal. They no longer confuse dysfunction with depth. They no longer interpret intensity as intimacy. Instead, they seek resonance, not rescue. They begin to attract people who take responsibility for their own healing, people who do not need saving but wish to grow alongside them. And that is when the empath realizes the secret. You were never meant to carry others' pain. You were meant to inspire them to carry it themselves. Because true empathy does not take from another what they must face. True empathy holds space without drowning in it. It's the ability to sit beside someone's suffering without mistaking it for your own. That is strength. That is mastery. The empath who refuses boundaries thinks they are practicing unconditional love. But unconditional love does not mean unconditional access. You can love someone and still deny them your energy. You can forgive someone and still never speak to them again. You can hold compassion in your heart while closing the door completely. That is the divine paradox. The empath must learn that closure is not cruelty and distance is not hate. The moment the empath understands this, they are no longer afraid of being misunderstood. They stop explaining themselves to those committed to misinterpreting their peace. Because peace does not require explanation. They no longer feel guilty for saying no. That word becomes holy on their tongue, a declaration of self-worth, a shield against emotional decay. No becomes the sound of rebirth. And for the first time, their empathy stops being a reaction and becomes a choice. They choose where to give, when to give, and who to give to. They stop giving from guilt and start giving from overflow. They stop offering love as survival and start offering love as abundance. Their compassion is no longer contaminated by codependency. Their kindness is no longer a strategy. It's an expression of awareness, deliberate, not desperate. That is when they step into their higher purpose to be conscious, not consumed. Because the world doesn't need more empaths who drown in everyone else's pain. It needs empaths who have learned to breathe underwater. Empaths who understand that boundaries are not barriers to connection, but the very foundation of authentic connection. Empaths who know that love without truth is manipulation, and compassion without strength is chaos. Empaths who have faced their shadow and realized that the greatest threat to their light is not darkness, but delusion. This kind of empath, the awakened empath, walks through life differently. Their energy is still soft, but it's no longer porous. Their heart is open, but it's no longer unguarded. They've learned that their peace is not negotiable. Because peace, once tasted, becomes the new baseline for existence. Once you've lived from awareness, you can never again settle for emotional survival. And so they start making decisions not from empathy, but from alignment. They no longer say, I understand you. They say, I understand you and I choose me. And that choice, repeated over and over, is how they reclaim their soul from the machinery of manipulation. Because the truth is, every time you betray yourself to save someone else, you teach your nervous system that love equals abandonment. But every time you honor yourself, even when it costs you approval, you teach your soul that love equals safety. That is how the empath heals, not by finding better people, but by becoming a truer person. They realize that their greatest act of compassion is not self-sacrifice, but self-respect. Because when you respect yourself, you become a mirror that reflects integrity back into the world. You stop enabling weakness and start inspiring strength. You stop healing the unhealed and start empowering the ready. And that is the turning point when your empathy becomes evolution. You no longer move through life trying to protect your sensitivity. You move through life using it as vision. You see the games people play, not to judge them, but to understand them. You sense the manipulation not to expose it, but to sidestep it. You see through illusions effortlessly, because you've stopped living through your own. The empath who sets boundaries becomes what Jung called the self-realized soul, a being no longer ruled by guilt, projection, or fear. They have integrated both sides of their nature, the giver and the guardian, the healer and the warrior, the light and the shadow. They've learned that the opposite of love is not hate, it's self-neglect. And so, they choose love not for others first, but for themselves. Not the fragile kind that begs for approval, but the fierce kind that refuses to betray its truth. That love becomes their compass, their boundary, their protection. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, sovereign, unshakable. And from that place, the empath finally becomes what they were always meant to be, not a savior, not a victim, but an alchemist. Someone who can walk through other people's pain without losing their shape. Someone who can face the collective shadow without collapsing under it. Someone who no longer absorbs the darkness, but transforms it simply by being conscious of it. That is power. That is purpose. And the empath, finally aware of their strength, smiles not because they've hardened, but because they've healed. They understand now that the monster they were running from was never out there. It was the part of themselves that they refused to see. But once they faced it, once they met it with awareness instead of fear, it dissolved back into light. And now they walk through life, radiant, discerning, whole. Because they've learned that boundaries are not protection from others, they are protection for the soul. And only a soul that protects itself can truly love the world without becoming its victim. That is the final evolution of the empath, when empathy and strength merge into one. When compassion stops being an open wound and becomes a living flame. A flame that no longer burns out for others, but lights the way for those ready to see. And as that living flame steadies, as the empath finally learns to burn without consuming themselves, something deeper unfolds, a kind of spiritual gravity. Their energy changes. It's no longer scattered across 1,000 emotional entanglements. It's anchored, focused, whole. People feel it before they understand it. They sense a calmness they cannot manipulate. They sense warmth, but also distance, a sacred distance that says you may approach, but you may not invade. This is what true power feels like, not dominance, not aggression, but containment. The ability to hold your energy, to hold your peace, to hold your truth, even when the world tries to pry it from your hands. Because make no mistake, once you embody peace, chaos will test it. The moment you stop feeding dysfunction, dysfunction will try to starve you into reaction. The moment you stop rescuing people, they'll accuse you of abandoning them. The moment you stop being available to chaos, chaos will label you cruel. But that is not cruelty. That is clarity. Carl Jung understood this tension better than anyone. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And to become who you truly are, you must disappoint every version of yourself that was built for survival." The empath, without boundaries, was a survival archetype, a defense mechanism born in childhood, when love was earned through caretaking, when attention was bought through compliance. That part of you learned early that the only way to stay safe was to make everyone else comfortable. But the awakened empath knows better. They understand that comfort is not safety, that peace built on people-pleasing is a lie, that survival is not the same as living. So they stop performing, they stop pretending, they stop explaining their boundaries to those who profit from them being broken. And in that refusal, they begin to recover something priceless, self-trust. Because every time you honor your boundary, you teach your nervous system that you can protect yourself. Every time you say no, you remind your soul that you are safe within your own care. That is the medicine. That is the true healing. Because no amount of love from others can ever replace the love you owe yourself. For years, the empath believed that love was something to give away, something to prove, something to chase. Now, they understand that love is something to embody. You do not attract what you want. You attract what you are. And when you become love-grounded, clear, self-respecting love, you draw only those who can meet you there. The people who cannot fall away, not because you are rejecting them, but because you are no longer matching their vibration. You have become too stable for chaos, too self-aware for manipulation, too peaceful for drama. That's the paradox of awakening. You lose much, but nothing real. The friendships that relied on your self-betrayal dissolve. The relationships that required your exhaustion crumble. The systems that demanded your compliance collapse. And though it feels lonely at first, that loneliness is sacred. It is the silence where your real self begins to breathe. It is in that silence that you finally hear your own voice, the one that was buried under everyone else's expectations, the one that knows exactly who you are and what you came here to do. Because the empath's true calling was never to absorb pain, it was to transmute it. You were never meant to carry the world's wounds. You were meant to show the world how healing looks. You do not heal others by suffering for them. You heal them by living as proof that suffering is not the end. That is why your boundaries are holy. They are not walls. They are frequencies. Each no refines your energy. Each act of self-respect sharpens your vibration. Each moment of silence strengthens your presence. Until one day, you realize something profound. You don't even need to defend your energy anymore, because your energy defends itself. It's no longer porous. It's luminous. No longer reactive. It's reflective. No longer grasping. It's grounded. You don't need to explain your absence to those who once fed on your attention. You don't need to justify your peace to those who thrive on chaos. You simply live, and your very existence becomes instruction. Because truth does not preach. Truth radiates. And now that truth flows through you like a quiet current of power. The same sensitivity that once made you feel fragile has become your intuition, razor sharp, precise, unwavering. You feel energy shift before words are spoken. You sense deception before it manifests. You walk into a room and instantly know who is anchored and who is pretending. You see it all, and yet you don't react, because awareness without reaction is mastery. That is the difference between the unhealed empath and the awakened one. The unhealed empath absorbs. The awakened empath observes. Observation is freedom. It's the power to see clearly without being consumed. And as you move through life in this new state, people begin to treat you differently, not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped apologizing for it. You no longer bend yourself to fit their comfort zones. You no longer lower your vibration to match their fear. You no longer dim your light to protect their illusions. You simply exist as truth, unfiltered, unbothered, untamed. And truth, once embodied, becomes a force of nature. It doesn't need to fight darkness. It simply shines, and darkness dissolves. This is the final evolution of empathy, when compassion and clarity become one. You can love deeply without losing yourself. You can feel everything without carrying everything. You can walk through the fire and emerge cleaner, not charred. You no longer see yourself as a savior, because you've realized that everyone must save themselves. You no longer see the world as broken, because you've realized that brokenness is the beginning of transformation. You no longer see pain as punishment, but as purification. And from that perspective, you move differently. You give differently. You live differently. You no longer run from darkness. You walk into it with light in your hands, because you know now that the shadow is not your enemy. It is your teacher. You've made peace with your own, and that peace has made you powerful beyond comprehension. The empath without boundaries becomes a victim of the world. The empath with boundaries becomes a mirror to it. The empath with awareness becomes a master of it. And mastery doesn't mean control, it means flow. It means you've stopped resisting life and started moving with it. You are no longer an open wound searching for purpose. You are purpose itself, breathing, aware, awake. You've faced your shadow. You've met your monster. You've learned that both light and dark speak the same language, energy. And you've learned to speak it fluently. Now, when people project their pain, you don't absorb it, you alchemize it. When they attack, you don't defend, you observe. When they manipulate, you don't react, you stand still. And their illusion collapses against your silence. That silence is not weakness. It is the sound of your sovereignty. It is the vibration of someone who has remembered who they are. And in that remembrance, you become untouchable, not because you hide, but because you have nothing left to hide from. That is the true destiny of the empath. Not to save the world, but to awaken within it. To remind others through your presence that peace is possible. That strength and sensitivity are not opposites, but allies. That love, when rooted in truth, can transform anything it touches. You are no longer the empath who breaks for others. You are the empath who builds bridges, boundaries, and light. And as you walk forward, you realize that the monsters you once feared no longer exist, because you have outgrown the frequency where they feed. You've stopped fearing becoming them, because you've transcended the polarity that created them. You are no longer shadow or light. You are the awareness that holds both. And that awareness, silent, eternal, and unshakable, is the true essence of power. That is what it means to be free. And so the empath, once consumed by the weight of the world, finally stands alone, not in loneliness, but in sovereignty. The silence that once felt unbearable now feels like home. The emptiness that once felt hollow now feels infinite. Because for the first time in their life, they are not reacting to life, they are being life. The war between compassion and self-preservation has ended. The pendulum no longer swings between guilt and resentment. The empath has found the still point, the sacred equilibrium between giving and grounding, between feeling and knowing, between being open and being whole. They finally understand. Peace was never about isolation. It was about integration. To be awake in a world of projection is no small task. It requires the death of who you were taught to be, the self-sacrificing savior, the one who confuses pain with purpose, chaos with connection, giving with worth. And when that old self dies, the new one doesn't rise like a phoenix. It rises like dawn, quiet, consistent, irreversible. That is what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." The empath has made the unconscious conscious. They no longer call their pain fate. They call it initiation. They no longer fear their shadow. They walk beside it. They no longer beg for love. They embody it. They are not light against darkness. They are the space in which both exist. And this space, this awareness, is where real power lives. It is no longer about saving anyone. It is no longer about proving anything. It is no longer about being good. It is about being true. Truth has replaced empathy's old obsession with fairness. Truth has replaced the need to be understood. Truth has replaced the illusion of control, because the awakened empath has realized that truth is not a comfort, it's a cleansing. It burns away what is false, what is performative, what is addicted to pity. It leaves behind only what is real, what is rooted, what is free. And freedom, that word so misunderstood, is not about escape. It's about embodiment. Freedom means you can love without losing yourself. You can care without carrying. You can feel everything without fearing it will destroy you. Freedom means you are no longer owned by your gift. You have mastered it. And once you master empathy, it becomes wisdom. Wisdom doesn't react, it responds. Wisdom doesn't absorb, it observes. Wisdom doesn't sacrifice, it understands. That wisdom is what the world needs now. Not more wounded empaths desperate to save broken souls, but awakened ones who can stand firm in truth, whose very presence dissolves illusion, whose boundaries inspire respect, whose peace radiates louder than chaos. You were never meant to heal others by destroying yourself. You were meant to show the world what healing looks like. A human being who feels deeply but stands tall. A human being who can walk through darkness without losing their light. A human being who understands that compassion without strength is slavery, and strength without compassion is tyranny, and that balance is the divine middle where true love lives. That is the empath's final form. Not the savior, not the martyr, but the mirror, clear, calm, and honest. They do not fight monsters anymore. They recognize that monsters are born from unhealed pain. And pain is not the enemy, ignorance is. And ignorance dissolves the moment awareness enters the room. So the empath no longer fights. They illuminate. They move quietly now. But their energy changes everything it touches. They don't argue with illusion, they outgrow it. They don't chase validation, they radiate truth. They don't seek power, they are power. Because true power is not force, it is alignment. It is the energy of someone who knows who they are, who does not abandon themselves to be loved, who does not apologize for their boundaries, who does not carry what was never theirs. It is the energy of someone who finally understands that to protect your peace is not selfish, it is sacred. And so the empath walks on softer than ever, but stronger than stone. A paradox of light and shadow, of tenderness and authority, of love that no longer leaks but overflows. They do not speak often, but when they do, their words carry weight. Because they are no longer speaking from wound, they are speaking from wisdom. They have become the living bridge between human chaos and divine order. They are the reminder that empathy, when awakened, is not fragility, it is fire. Not the kind that burns the world, but the kind that warms it back to life. The empath's story was never about saving others. It was about remembering themselves the moment they finally understood that to honor your energy is to honor existence itself. That your love is not meant to be currency, it's meant to be creation. And so they close their eyes, take a breath, and smile. Because they know deeply, immovably, that they are no longer running from the monster. They have outgrown it. They have integrated it. They have become the wholeness that darkness can no longer touch. And in that wholeness, they find the ultimate peace, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of presence, the peace that needs no defense, the peace that radiates quietly, fearlessly, infinitely. And that is where the story ends, not in light or shadow, not in victory or loss, but in truth. The empath is no longer the victim of their gift. They are the keeper of it. And from this day forward, they walk not as a healer of others, but as a guardian of energy, the living embodiment of what Jung called individuation, the meeting point of all opposites within the self. They are not here to escape the world. They are here to awaken it. And that awakening begins, as it always does, with one simple, unshakable truth. The empath who learns to protect their light will never again fear the dark.